All right, welcome to the College Lifter Show. I'm your host, Will Everell. I'm here with Ryan Capers, my co-host. And this week we're going to be talking about how to overhaul your squats.
Oh, yeah.
Which this is a big thing. I mean, everyone loves squatting. You see Corey Greger with the squat every day, which I'm a big fan of. It's a big thing in the world right now.
Yeah.
So what are some of the biggest things you see that are wrong with people's squats?
Some of the biggest things with the squat are definitely... and everybody's different depending on what you think is bad versus what's actually bad. But most people can't squat all the way. Most people, get like that 3/4 squat. Now, one thing that I talk about a lot to my athletes is I hate the idea of that 90 degrees is a special magical place that you have to get past, and it doesn't exist. It's not an actual thing. There's nothing that says you have to get to 90 degrees or you're not going to get strong at your squats. Now, there is research that shows if you're stopping your squats early, you are jamming your knee forward, getting that shearing force in the joint. And that's a real thing. But I hate how much emphasis is on that 90 degrees.
It's a competition. It's a competition standard that's been applied to training. It's like, well, you're going to train like you compete, so you can stay there. But you can't throw someone in there who starts butt winking and tucking under at a quarter squat and say you got to go halfway.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think for the average person, it doesn't matter. It's not a real thing. Now, obviously, you want the mobility to have full range of motion in anything you do, right? But there's no reason you can't say you don't squat what you think you squat because you can't squat that low. Right. I think it's all very relative to what you can do and what your mobility allows you to do.
Right. I agree. So, staying symmetrical with your squat, one of the things so we look at increasing your range of motion in the squat, getting deeper. A lot of like the go-to stuff is the hip capsule mobility and all that, where you've got one leg out, one leg back, and you're trying to exaggerate one hip's position in the squat to kind of go in and out, do that contract, relax, to get lower. Something that I kind of noticed with myself is I was like, I got pretty good. People always say, I have good mobility and all this. I started to realize my hips were kind of canting. So as my right hip was being mobilized, I would drop my left hip, which would give me a little bit more slack. But that's nothing like the position I'm going to be in the squat. Mm-hmm. And so it's a compensation that really doesn't do me any good because I'm getting really, really loose in a position that isn't the one I'm going to compete in.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have that problem. Everybody's got like we just said, everybody has their own very specific mobility issues. Nobody's perfectly symmetrical. Nobody's going to have the same mobility on both sides unless you're absolutely perfect. But just daily life, how different things hit us and injuries and all these crazy things, we're going to be a little different side to side. So it's really easy whenever you're doing that mobility to cater one side over the other. So best thing you can do is just be conscious of that and watch your body while you're doing these things. While you're doing, don't ever let it just be routine. Okay, I'm doing my hip capsule stretch or my couch stretch or whatever it may be. Don't ever let it just be routine. Always check yourself. Always be running that self-diagnostic and say, okay, am I square? Are my shoulders where they need to be? Am I keeping my chest exactly where it needs to be? All these little things, because it all adds up.
It does. I think a lot of times, like, doing a CrossFit gym thing or even some of the weightlifting classes that are coming out now at a lot of these gyms, the mobility seems like just a going through the motions thing, a warm-up. Like, be conscious when you're in those positions. How am I? Am I squared up? Is this the same position? And how can I force myself through more range of motion through that contract, relax cycle?
Yep, I agree with that.
So, internal versus external rotation. Everyone talks about external rotation to stabilize the hips and the knees in the squat. One of the biggest things that I see, though, is if you're lacking, so I have zero internal rotation most of the time. I sit at the desk a lot. I drink a lot of caffeine. It's finals week. That's how it is. And so I get really brutally tight, and the less internal rotation I have, the less stable I am trying to externally rotate.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? About training something, or not training something, but working on something that almost seems counterintuitive?
I think we have to go back and just look at the basic anatomy. It's easy to say, okay, and if you don't know what internal and external rotation at the hip are, it's basically, so imagine you're in a seated position. Let's visualize a model of a human. We're looking at them from the side. We have a head here, body. Their leg's going to come forward to the knee, and then foot down here. So if we're looking at them from the side and they're bringing their foot out towards you, now that's going to be internal rotation of the hip, because we're looking at this at the femur here. The top of the femur where it comes out is going to rise, closing in towards the body, so it's internal rotation. And whenever the foot goes across, like you're crossing your legs, the outside of the femur is dropping in away from the body. That's external rotation. So now whenever we think about squatting, if we're looking at it from the front now, and we're looking at a shin, if these are both legs, if the shin falls out, that's external rotation. We're looking at the leg being able to externally rotate. A lot of times we're avoiding the pelvis collapsing through the legs, which is what you have to do to be able to squat to full depth, which is, kind of going back to what we were talking about, is why most people can't squat to full depth, because they can't let their pelvis pass through both femurs. Now with the internal rotation, how it relates to the external rotation, we look at the two main internal rotators of the groin, how they attach up high from the pelvis and then around to the back side of the upper femur.
Yeah.
Well, whenever we take the leg into full flexion, and that's a short muscle, it's going to pull the leg in.
Yeah, it's going to spin you inside.
Yeah, because it does serve that function of being an internal rotator, but also it's still a muscle. Whenever you try and pull it long and it doesn't want to go long, it's going to pull you into place. So we have to let those internal rotators be loose, even though it doesn't look like the same motion. We have to let those be loose to be able to still take the leg through the full range of motion.
And I think you brought up a great point there, is when you look at what is your range of motion, loaded versus unloaded?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you see a lot of people who do yoga and all that, and I think yoga is great, but there is a difference between your position loaded and unloaded. So if you've got I can move, I can do all this stuff, it's like, well, let's throw a bar on your back. Let's throw 135 pounds, which for most guys is pretty light. Then let's see how you move.
Yep.
Then let's look at that. And I think that's where a lot of good band stuff comes in, because you can artificially load that area.
Yeah, absolutely, because there is no doubt a difference between active and passive mobility.
Yeah.
Whether or not a muscle under pressure is going to be able to lengthen to a certain length versus just be able to pull that muscle to a certain length.
And some of that's just neural control. Like, can you control that muscle, or is it just this freak out response of finding stability wherever you can?
Absolutely, I agree.
So, leading from that, going into single versus double leg, a lot of people can create a lot of that force, a lot of that external rotation force with both legs. But then you try to give them on just one leg, and it's just wobbling back and forth, and they're falling all over the place. How do you address that?
I think there's a couple things we have to think about here. One thing you mentioned a second ago is your neurological facilitation in those movements. If your nervous system just doesn't recognize squatting on one leg, because you don't ever do it, you're not going to do it very well. You have to practice something to do it well. That's plain and simple. So if you don't squat on one leg often, you're just not going to do it well. So if you try, like, say, Bulgarian split squats for the first time and it doesn't go so hot, keep trying. You're probably going to get better regardless. Now, whenever we talk about how mobility affects that, which is the other point we want to think about, your legs can kind of, whenever we're using both, they can kind of save each other. They can kind of balance each other. Your hips can rotate into a specific position that's going to let you kind of bypass some restrictions. Right. Now, whenever we go to one, you have nothing to save you. So whenever we go to that one, if you're seeing a lot of knee play, if you're seeing a lot your ankle trying to stabilize, there's something going on in that system that needs to be released to let it act more fluid. Yeah,
I think you'll actually see a whole lot better positioning from your full squat if you work on some single leg stuff on each side.
100%. That's without going into too much detail, that's almost common sense to think that if one thing can work really well by itself and another thing can work well by itself, they're probably going to work really well together.
Yeah. So programming, or initiating the squat, sorry. I jumped ahead.
That's okay.
So initiating the squat. You talked to me earlier about a difference in how you load your musculature versus front squat, overhead squat, back squat. What do you...
Yeah, so there's a few things we want to think about when we're looking at the different styles of squatting. So the main thing that I look at is torso angle. So we think about a back squat. Now, without going to whenever I say back squat, we're going to think about more of an Olympic style high bar squat. So versus like a powerlifting squat, even though they have a lot of similarities. That low bar style squat where the torso is going way forward, which is fine. That's a great way to move a lot of weight. An Olympic style high bar squat, we're still getting some torso lean. So now we look at front squat, because if you do lean forward, you are going to drop the bar just because gravity is a thing. You're not able to lean as far forward with the torso. And then whenever we look at a overhead squat, the bar is going to be right over your shoulders. Because of how gravity works, the bar has to stay right over your center of mass and your center of gravity to be able to perform the squat. So now your torso has to be vertical. Now, going back into all those, the way that we can keep our torso in those positions, in a back squat, we have to always think about initiating the hips first.
Mm-hmm.
So hips have to go back first into the squat because we are dropping back, trying to activating those hamstrings and the glutes, getting sort of that strict reflex when we're coming out of the bottom. And then in a front squat and an overhead squat, because we are keeping the torso more vertical, we do have to bring the knees forward first. That's how we initiate differently, by bringing the knees forward first, because we are going to keep that more vertical torso position. Now, whenever I say bring the knees forward first, I don't mean just jam your knees forward, go to in range, and then activate your hips. It's obviously a very fluid thing, and saying there's different initiation is being a little bit nitpicky about the squat.
We're talking about like microseconds.
Yeah. Everything's going to move at the same time. It's just what's moving more dramatically first. Yeah. So the hips and the knees are still going to begin moving at the same time, but the knees are just going to move a little bit more exaggeratedly than the hips will.
Really, if you're more of a kind of analytical mind, you can think the bar is always moving in the same direction.
Always.
It's already right over the middle of your foot, basically, right in front of your ankle. But you can manipulate yourself depending on where that bar is to change, and that's going to change your mechanics.
Yep.
So that's really makes it pretty simple.